She stood in the marble lobby of her own five-star hotel, designer luggage at her feet, while the man she'd personally hired 18 months ago looked through her like she was invisible, or worse, like she didn't belong. In 8 minutes, everything would change. Hello, my wonderful family. I can't thank you enough for always being here. Your love and support truly mean everything to me. If you're excited for today's story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from. And guess what? Tomorrow I'll be back with another story just as thrilling. You definitely don't want to miss it. Now, let's jump right in. The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Grandview Hotel as Amara Wellington stepped through the revolving door, her Louboutin heels clicking softly against the Italian marble. After 3 months in Tokyo finalizing the acquisition of 2 boutique hotels, she was exhausted, jet-lagged, and looking forward to nothing more than sinking into the penthouse suite she designed herself. She paused in the atrium, taking in the familiar scent of white orchids and sandalwood that she'd specifically chosen for the hotel's signature fragrance. Everything looked perfect. The crystal chandeliers cast warm light over guests in evening wear, soft jazz drifted from the bar, and her staff moved with a practiced elegance she'd spent years cultivating. Laura had built Wellington luxury hotels from nothing. 5 years ago, she'd been a junior executive at a major chain, watching as beautiful properties were run into the ground by managers who cared more about quarterly profits than guest experience. Now at 34, she owned 17 properties across 3 continents, each one a testament to her belief that luxury wasn't about gold fixtures. It was about making people feel seen, valued, respected. Her phone buzzed with yet another congratulatory text about the Tokyo deal. The business press had been calling her the hospitality industry's rising star, and a visionary who's changing the game. Tonight, she just wanted to be Laura, not CEO Wellington. She deliberately kept her return quiet, wanting to slip in unnoticed and rest before tomorrow's staff meeting where she'd announce the expansion. She moved toward the front desk, her simple black dress and rain-dampened hair making her look more like a weary traveler than the woman whose portrait hung in the hotel's executive offices upstairs. Meanwhile, behind the gleaming front desk, James Morrison straightened his tie and surveyed his domain with satisfaction. At 28, he'd been the Grandview's front desk manager for 18 months, and he ran his shift like a military operation. Every guest interaction was flawless, every detail perfect. The hotel had received its highest customer satisfaction scores under his watch, and he took personal pride in maintaining what he called standards. Those standards, however, had certain interpretations. David had grown up in the suburbs, the son of an insurance broker who drilled into him the importance of reading people correctly. You can tell everything about someone in the first 5 seconds, his father used to say. Dress, posture, the way they carry themselves, it never lies. At the Grandview, James applied this philosophy religiously. He could spot a VIP from across the atrium, the confident stride, the expensive accessories, the way they expected service without asking. These were the guests who mattered, the ones who tip generously and leave glowing reviews. The ones who belonged in a place like this. Then there were the others. The ones who dressed too casually, who seemed uncertain, who didn't quite fit the Grandview's image. James had become expert at managing these situations with what he called professional redirection, politely suggesting they might be more comfortable at the Holiday Inn down the street, or discovering sudden booking issues that required them to leave. His assistant manager, Jennifer Hayes, often looked uncomfortable during these interactions, but she never said anything. The rest of the evening staff, Marcus the concierge, Sandra from guest services, even the bellhops, had learned to follow James's lead. He was, after all, management. Tonight felt different though. There was tension in the air, maybe from the storm, or maybe from the rumor mill that had been churning about some big announcement coming from corporate. David straightened a stack of registration forms and checked his watch. 9:47 p.m. Almost time for the shift change, but he'd stay late as always, making sure every detail was perfect. He looked up as a woman approached the desk, mid-30s, black, traveling alone with expensive luggage but somehow looking out of place. Her dress was nice enough, but she seemed tired, uncertain. Not their usual clientele. David's trained I took inventory, designer bag, probably a knockoff, good jewelry, could be rented, confident posture, trying too hard. His internal radar pinged with familiar warnings. This was exactly the type of situation that required careful handling. Jennifer was helping another guest, so James stepped forward with his practiced smile, the one that looked welcoming but carried just enough coolness to establish boundaries. "Good evening," he said, his tone professionally neutral. "How may I help you?" Laura looked up at the young man behind the desk, noting his perfect posture and practiced smile. She didn't recognize him immediately. With 17 properties and over 3,000 employees, she couldn't know everyone personally, though she tried to visit each location regularly. "Good evening," she replied, pulling out her phone to check her confirmation details. "I have a reservation. Wellington." She watched his fingers move across the keyboard, then pause. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around the eyes, a barely noticeable stiffening of his shoulders. "I'm not seeing anything under that name," he said, though he'd barely looked at the screen. "Are you certain you have a reservation at this property?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implication. Laura felt a familiar knot form in her stomach, that awful recognition that had followed her throughout her career, the moment when she realized someone was looking at her and seeing not a successful businesswoman, but a problem to be solved. "Yes," she said quietly, keeping her voice level. "I'm certain. Could you check again, please? It should be under Wellington, Penthouse Suite." James's eyebrows rose slightly. The penthouse? That was their crown jewel, $15,000 a night, reserved for celebrities and foreign dignitaries. He glanced at her again, the tired eyes, the simple dress, the way she seemed to shrink slightly under his scrutiny. This was exactly the kind of situation his father had warned him about. What do you think James should do in this moment? Have you ever witnessed discrimination in a service setting? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your perspective on how prejudice can blind us to the truth. James stared at his computer screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as if the system might magically produce a reservation that didn't exist. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken implications. Other guests moved through the atrium behind Laura, their conversations a distant hum, but here at the front desk, the air felt charged with tension. "Ma'am," James said finally, his voice taking on that particular tone, polite but condescending, the kind service workers used when they wanted to establish hierarchy without being overtly rude. "I've checked our system thoroughly. There's no reservation under Wellington for tonight. Or any night this week, for that matter." Laura felt heat rise in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "Perhaps there's been a mistake with the booking system. Could you check under Wellington Hotels? Or maybe call your night manager." "Our system doesn't make mistakes," James replied, a slight edge creeping into his professional facade. He glanced toward Jennifer, who was now free and watching the interaction with growing discomfort. "Jennifer, have you seen any corporate bookings under Wellington tonight?" Jennifer approached hesitantly, her fingers nervous on her tablet. Let me check the VIP list," she said quietly. Laura watched as the young woman's eyes scanned the screen, then widened slightly. Jennifer looked up at Laura, then at James, confusion written across her face. "Actually, there is a—" "Nothing," James interrupted smoothly, his hand subtly touching Jennifer's arm. "Right, Jen? No Wellington reservation." Jennifer's mouth opened, then closed. She looked between them again, her internal conflict visible. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Right. No reservation." The betrayal hit Laura like a physical blow. She'd seen this dance before, the way people would rather go along with discrimination than risk confrontation, how they'd sacrifice truth for comfort. But watching it happen in her own hotel, perpetrated by people she employed, people whose paychecks bore her signature, felt like having her heart torn out. "I see," Laura said quietly. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "Let me call corporate and sort this out." "Ma'am," James said, stepping slightly forward, his body language becoming more assertive. "I don't want to make this unpleasant, but this is a private establishment. If you don't have a confirmed reservation, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The words hung in the air like a slap. Laura looked around the atrium, at the guests sipping champagne in the lounge area, at the bellhop standing ready to assist, at the security guard who had noticed the commotion and was now walking over. This was her world, her creation, her legacy. Every piece of furniture, every lighting fixture, every carefully chosen detail bore her personal touch. And she was being thrown out of it. "You're asking me to leave?" Laura's voice was barely above a whisper, but something in her tone made James take a half step back. "I'm asking you to find accommodations elsewhere," he said, his confidence wavering slightly under her steady gaze. "There are several lovely hotels nearby that might better suit your needs." The pause before needs was loaded with meaning that made Laura's stomach turn. She'd heard variations of this conversation countless times throughout her career, the subtle suggestions that she'd be more comfortable somewhere else, that perhaps she'd fit in better at a different company, a different conference, a different world. "And what exactly do you think my needs are?" Laura asked, her voice gaining strength. James's professional mask was slipping now. The other guests were starting to stare, and he could feel the situation spiraling beyond his control. This woman wasn't backing down the way she was supposed to. She wasn't apologizing or shuffling away in embarrassment. Instead, she was standing taller, her presence somehow filling the space around the desk. "Look, lady," he said, dropping the pretense of politeness, "this is the Grandview Hotel. Our guests are a certain caliber. I'm sure you understand." The words echoed through the atrium's soaring ceiling. Several nearby conversations stopped. The security guard, a middle-aged black man named Robert whom Laura had personally hired after he'd been laid off from another hotel, approached with concern written across his features. "Is there a problem here?" Robert asked, his eyes moving between James and Laura. "No problem, Bob," James said quickly. "Just explaining to this lady that we don't have any availability tonight." Robert looked at Laura, really looked at her, and something flickered in his expression. Recognition? Uncertainty? He'd been working here for 6 months, had seen the CEO's photo in the employee handbook, but this tired woman in front of him seemed so different from the polished executive in the corporate headshot. "Ma'am," Robert said carefully, "is there something I can help you with?" Laura met his eyes and saw a kindness there that had been absent from James's interaction. "I was hoping to check into my reservation," she said simply. "But apparently, there seems to be some confusion." Behind the desk, Jennifer was staring at her tablet screen, her face pale. She'd found the corporate booking, penthouse suite, indefinite stay, booked under L. Wellington with a note that read CEO, do not disturb under any circumstances. Her hands were shaking as she realized what had just transpired. James, meanwhile, was doubling down. "Bob, could you please escort this lady out? She's causing a disturbance, and our guests are starting to notice." The moment crystallized like glass about to shatter. Laura stood in the center of her own empire, surrounded by people she employed, being treated like an unwelcome intruder. The humiliation was complete, absolute, devastating. But beneath the hurt, something else was building. Something that had been forged in boardrooms where she was the only woman, in negotiations where people assumed she was the secretary, in countless moments where she'd had to prove her worth simply because of who she was. Power. Pure, quiet, unstoppable power. Laura pulled out her phone and dialed a number. When the voice answered, she spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "Security? This is Laura Wellington. I need you to come to the front desk immediately." James laughed, actually laughed. "Lady, I don't know who you think you're calling, but—" "CEO Wellington?" The voice crackled through the phone speaker, audible to everyone within 10 feet. "We'll be right down. Is everything all right?" The color drained from James's face. Jennifer dropped her tablet. Robert's eyes widened in recognition and horror. In the sudden, terrible silence, Laura looked at each of them in turn. When she spoke, her voice was calm, quiet, and absolutely devastating. "Now," she said, "let's talk about that reservation." The silence that followed Laura's revelation stretched like a taut wire about to snap. James stood frozen behind the front desk, his face cycling through expressions: disbelief, panic, and finally, desperate calculation. The corporate security team's footsteps echoed across the atrium's hardwood floors, growing closer with each second. That's impossible," James stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands gripped the edge of the marble counter so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "You can't be. I mean, you're not." "Not what?" Laura's voice was deadly quiet, but it carried across the space with surgical precision. "Finish your sentence, James." The use of his name, spoken with the authority of someone who had every right to know it, made him flinch as if she'd struck him. Around them, the evening's elegant atmosphere continued its gentle hum, but their small corner of the atrium had become an island of tension. Jennifer backed away from the desk, her tablet clutched against her chest like a shield. I didn't know," she whispered. "James, I tried to tell you there was a corporate booking, but you said—" "Shut up, Jen," James hissed, his professional composure completely shattered. His mind was racing, searching for an escape route from the nightmare unfolding around him. This is some kind of mistake. Some kind of scam. People impersonate executives all the time. Laura watched him with a detached interest of a scientist observing a specimen. She'd seen this before, the denial phase that always preceded the bargaining. People would rather believe in elaborate conspiracies than accept that they'd revealed their true nature to the wrong person. The security team arrived, 3 men in crisp black suits, led by Captain Rodriguez, the head of hotel security. Laura had personally approved his hiring after his distinguished service with the NYPD. Rodriguez took one look at the scene and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "Ms. Wellington," he said, his voice respectful but concerned. "We came as soon as you called. Is there a security issue?" James's eyes darted between Laura and Rodriguez, searching for any sign that this was an elaborate performance. "Rodriguez, you can't seriously believe." "That's enough," Rodriguez said sharply, his attention focused entirely on Laura. "Ma'am, what do you need us to do?" Laura looked at James, who was now visibly sweating despite the atrium's perfect climate control. She could see the wheels turning in his head, the desperate search for a way to minimize, deflect, or escape the consequences of his actions. "I need you to pull the security footage from the last 15 minutes, Laura said calmly. "I want a complete record of this interaction." "Already being done, ma'am," Rodriguez replied. "Should I call Mr. Harrison?" He was referring to the hotel's general manager, Laura's direct report. "Not yet," Laura said, her eyes never leaving James's face. "I want to give Mr. Morrison here a chance to explain himself first." James's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. When he finally found his voice, it came out in a rush of defensive justifications. "Look, even if you are who you say you are, I was just doing my job. I'm supposed to screen guests, make sure they belong here. You have to admit, you don't exactly look like." He stopped abruptly, realizing he was about to dig himself even deeper. "Like what?" Laura prompted, her voice dangerously soft. "Like corporate leadership," James finished lamely. "You were dressed casually, you seemed tired, you didn't announce yourself. How was I supposed to know?" It was the wrong answer, and everyone in the vicinity could feel it. The few guests who had noticed the commotion were now openly staring, some pulling out phones to record what was clearly becoming a dramatic confrontation. Jennifer, who had been silent since her earlier stumble, suddenly stepped forward. "Actually," she said, her voice shaking, "I recognized her name in the system. There was a VIP notation, but James told me to ignore it. He said sometimes people try to use fake names to get upgrades." James spun toward her, his face flushing with anger. "That's not, you're twisting what happened. I was protecting the hotel's interests." "By ejecting the owner?" Rodriguez asked incredulously. The words hit James like a physical blow. The owner. Not just some executive or board member, but the actual owner of the property he'd been so zealously protecting. The full scope of his mistake was beginning to dawn on him, and with it came a panic that made his earlier composure look like absolute calm. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising despite the public setting. "You people are acting like I committed some kind of crime. I made a judgment call based on the information I had. Maybe it was wrong, but it wasn't malicious. I'm good at my job, ask anyone. The guest satisfaction scores under my management have been the highest this hotel has ever seen." Laura listened to his desperate recitation of credentials with the patience of someone who had heard similar justifications countless times. The familiar script of discrimination denial: "I'm not prejudiced, I'm just thorough. I treat everyone the same. You're being too sensitive. This is all a big misunderstanding. Your guest satisfaction scores," Laura said quietly, "are only measuring the satisfaction of guests you allow to stay." The observation landed like a surgical strike. James opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, finally beginning to grasp the deeper implications of what he'd revealed about his screening process. Robert, the security guard who had tried to help earlier, stepped closer to Laura. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm sorry I didn't recognize you immediately. If there's anything I can do." "You tried to help," Laura said, offering him a small, genuine smile. "That matters more than recognition." The contrast wasn't lost on anyone present. The security guard had shown respect and offered assistance. The front desk manager had shown contempt and demanded removal. James, watching this exchange, made one final attempt to salvage the situation. "Look, Ms. Wellington, if you really are Ms. Wellington, this is all just a big misunderstanding. I was overzealous, maybe, but my heart was in the right place. I can fix this. I can make this right." Laura turned back to him, and something in her expression made him take an involuntary step backward. "Can you?" she asked. "Can you fix the fact that you looked at me and saw someone who didn't belong? Can you fix the moment when you decided I wasn't worthy of basic respect? Can you fix the system you've created here where staff members are afraid to speak up when they know something is wrong?" Each question hit like a hammer blow, and James visibly shrunk under the weight of them. "I want to see the guest feedback specifically about front desk interactions," Laura continued. "I want to review your hiring practices, your training materials, and every complaint that's been filed in the last 18 months. The blood drained from James's face. "You can't. I mean, you're going to destroy my career over one mistake." Laura looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "James," she said finally, "you destroyed your own career. I'm just going to make sure you don't destroy anyone else's dignity in the process." "Nobody leaves," Laura said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Not until we sort this out completely." The words hung in the air as hotel guests continued their evening routines around them, blissfully unaware that their elegant sanctuary had become the site of a corporate reckoning. Laura pulled out her phone and sent a quick text. Within moments, the elevator chimed, and Michael Harrison, the hotel's general manager, emerged looking disheveled and concerned. "Laura," he said, slightly out of breath from clearly rushing down from his apartment on the executive floor. "Security said there was an incident." "What's?" He stopped mid-sentence as he took in the scene. James pale and sweating behind the front desk, Jennifer clutching her tablet like a lifeline, Rodriguez and his team standing at attention, and Laura's expression of controlled fury. "Michael," Laura said, her tone professional but laced with steel, "I need the Neptune conference room cleared and secured. We're going to have an emergency staff meeting." The Neptune room was the hotel's smallest conference space, tucked away from guest areas, intimate enough to create pressure, private enough to prevent escape. Michael nodded quickly, already understanding the gravity of whatever had transpired. "Of course. Should I call?" "Just the evening front desk staff for now," Laura interrupted. "And pull all their employment files. Also, I need the guest complaint database for the last 18 months, and all security footage from tonight downloaded to a secure drive." James made a sound that might have been a whimper. The systematic nature of Laura's requests was making it clear that this wasn't going to be a simple conversation or reprimand. This was a full investigation. "Ma'am," Jennifer said tentatively, I have a class tomorrow morning. Could I possibly?" "No," Laura said without turning toward her. "You had a choice to make 15 minutes ago, Jennifer. You made it. Now you get to live with the consequences." The harshness of the statement made Jennifer flinch, but Laura felt no sympathy. In her climb to the top of the hospitality industry, she'd learned that complicity was often more dangerous than outright hostility. James's prejudice was obvious and ugly, but Jennifer's willingness to go along with it, to stay silent when she knew the truth, that was the kind of institutional rot that destroyed organizations from within. Michael returned quickly, confirming that the conference room was ready. "The files you requested are being compiled," he said. "Should take about 20 minutes. "Perfect." Laura looked at James, who seemed to be considering making a break for the exit. "Mr. Morrison, you'll wait with the others. Consider yourself suspended as of this moment, pending the outcome of our discussion." "Suspended?" James's voice cracked slightly. "You can't just suspend me without following proper procedures. There are employment laws, union regulations." "There are also discrimination laws," Laura replied smoothly. "And I have a room full of witnesses to what just happened. Would you like to discuss legal procedures, James?" The threat was subtle but unmistakable. James closed his mouth and nodded reluctantly. As they made their way to the conference room, Laura noticed how the small group moved. James walked as far from her as possible, his eyes darting toward exits like a trapped animal. Jennifer stayed close to the walls, trying to make herself invisible. Robert, still in his security uniform, maintained a respectful distance but seemed genuinely remorseful. Marcus, the concierge who had been called in from his post, looked confused and increasingly worried as the gravity of the situation became clear. The Neptune room was exactly as Laura remembered designing it: intimate mahogany walls, a round table that encouraged conversation, and no windows. Tonight, it felt more like an interrogation chamber than a meeting space. "Sit," Laura said simply, taking her position at the head of the table. The others arranged themselves uncomfortably around the polished surface, the silence broken only by the soft hum of the ventilation system. Michael entered with a stack of files and a laptop, setting them in front of Laura with practiced efficiency. "The complaint database is loaded, and the security footage from this evening is queued up," he said quietly. "Thank you, Michael. Please stay for this." Laura opened the first file, James Morrison's employment record. She read it silently, her expression revealing nothing, while the assembled staff sat in uncomfortable silence. The psychological pressure was intentional. She wanted them to understand that their words and actions had consequences, that their assumptions about who did or didn't belong in their workplace had led them to this moment. "Impressive resume, James," Laura said finally, looking up from the file. "Dean's List, hospitality management degree, excellent references from your previous positions. Your interview notes mention your attention to detail and your commitment to maintaining high standards." She closed the file with a soft thud. "Tell me, what do you think went wrong tonight?" James shifted in his chair, his earlier panic now mixed with a kind of desperate cunning. "I think there was a communication breakdown," he said carefully. "Perhaps if there had been better protocols in place for identifying VIP guests." "Stop," Laura said sharply. "Just stop. You're sitting in a room with people who witnessed what happened. Don't insult our intelligence with corporate speak." She turned to Jennifer. "You recognized my name in the system. You saw the VIP notation. Why didn't you speak up when it mattered?" Jennifer's hands trembled as she set down her tablet. James is my supervisor. He's been here longer, he knows the procedures better than I do. When he said to ignore it, I thought maybe he knew something I didn't." "You thought I was lying about who I was?" "I don't know," Jennifer whispered. "I was confused. It all happened so fast, and James seemed so certain." Laura turned to Marcus, who had been silent since entering the room. "You've been here 3 years, Marcus. You've seen me during my quarterly visits. Did you recognize me tonight?" Marcus nodded slowly. I thought you looked familiar, but you seemed so different. Tired. And when James was handling the situation, I figured." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "You figured he knew what he was doing," Laura completed. "Even when your instincts told you something was wrong." The room fell silent again, the weight of collective responsibility settling over them like a heavy blanket. Laura could see the realization dawning on their faces. This wasn't just about James's prejudice. It was about a system that allowed one person's bias to override multiple people's better judgment. "Here's what's going to happen," Laura said, her voice calm but implacable. "We're going to review every guest interaction from the past 18 months. We're going to examine every complaint, every redirected guest, every mysterious booking issue. And we're going to sit here together until we understand exactly how deep this problem goes." James made one last desperate attempt to escape. "Look, I'll resign. Effective immediately. We can call this a misunderstanding and move on. No need to drag everyone else into." "Everyone else is already in it," Laura cut him off. "The moment they chose to go along with your professional judgment, instead of speaking up for what was right. The moment they prioritized their comfort over a guest's dignity. The moment they decided that fitting in was more important than standing up." She opened her laptop and brought up the complaint database. "We're going to start with January of last year and work our way forward. Every single incident. And nobody leaves this room until we're done." The finality in her voice made it clear that this wasn't a negotiation. They were trapped together in this small space, forced to confront not just James's actions, but their own complicity in creating an environment where discrimination could flourish unchecked. Outside, the hotel continued its elegant evening routine. Inside the Neptune room, a reckoning had begun. Laura's fingers moved across the laptop keyboard with surgical precision, pulling up complaint records that painted a devastating picture. The silence in the Neptune room was suffocating as she read through months of carefully coded discrimination, each entry a small wound in her hotel's reputation. January 15th, last year, Laura began, her voice steady but cold. Guest complaint from Dr. Aisha Patel, a cardiologist from Mumbai. She had a confirmed reservation but was told upon arrival that there had been a system error and was redirected to a Holiday Inn. Laura looked up at James. Your shift, James. Your signature on the incident report. James shifted uncomfortably. I remember that. There was genuinely a booking issue. Dr. Patel paid with an American Express black card, Laura continued, reading from the screen. Her corporate account was set up through our Mumbai partner hotel. She was here for a medical conference at Johns Hopkins. What exactly about her screamed booking issue to you? The question hung in the air like an accusation. James opened his mouth, then closed it, the excuses dying on his lips. February 3rd, Laura continued relentlessly. Marcus Washington, a software executive from Seattle, told his reservation had been accidentally cancelled and offered a room at a Marriott downtown. She looked at James again. Another system error? Jennifer was staring at her hands, her face pale. I remember Mr. Washington, she whispered. He was so polite about it. He just accepted it and left. March 22nd. The Johnson family, husband, wife, 2 children. Here for their daughter's Georgetown University interview. Laura's voice was getting quieter, more dangerous. Told we were overbooked despite having a 2-room suite reserved and paid for 3 months in advance. Marcus, the concierge, looked sick. I remember them too. The little girl was so excited about staying in a fancy hotel. The father he looked so disappointed, but he didn't argue. Laura closed the laptop with a sharp snap. The pattern was undeniable, guest after guest, all with confirmed reservations, all turned away for mysterious system errors and booking issues. The common thread wasn't hard to identify. 13 incidents in 18 months, Laura said. 13 guests who looked like me, who were made to feel they didn't belong in their own reserved rooms. She stood and walked to the window, though it showed only the reflection of the conference room's lights. When she turned back to face them, her expression was raw with a pain that went deeper than tonight's humiliation. I built this company because I was tired of being that guest, she said quietly. Do you know what it's like to walk into a beautiful hotel, knowing you can afford anything on the menu, and still feel like you have to prove your right to exist in that space? The room was dead silent. I was 26 when I had my first experience with professional redirection, Laura continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone telling a story she'd never shared before. I was a junior executive then, sent to represent my company at a hospitality conference in Charleston. I had a reservation at the most prestigious hotel in the city, paid for by my company, confirmed 3 times. She sat back down, but her posture remained rigid, defensive. The desk clerk looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language when I gave my name. Suddenly, there were computer problems. System glitches. A mysterious water leak that had made my reserved room uninhabitable. I was politely directed to a motel 6 miles away. Jennifer made a small sound of distress, but Laura continued without acknowledging it. I found out later that my white male colleague, who had flown in that same day for the same conference, had been upgraded to a suite without even asking. When I confronted the hotel manager the next morning, do you know what he told me? No one answered. He said there must have been a misunderstanding, and that surely I could appreciate their need to maintain certain standards for their reputation. Laura's hands clenched into fists on the table. He made it clear that the problem wasn't their discrimination, it was my unrealistic expectations. The weight of her story settled over the room like a physical presence. James was staring at the table, his earlier defiance completely gone. That night, sitting in that motel room, I made 2 promises to myself, Laura continued. First, that I would never again allow anyone to make me feel like I didn't belong somewhere I had earned the right to be. And second, that if I ever had the power to create something better, I would. She gestured around the room, encompassing not just the conference space but the entire hotel. This company exists because I believed hospitality could be different. I believed we could create spaces where everyone, felt valued and respected. Where the color of someone's skin or the accent in their voice wouldn't determine whether they got the room they paid for. Laura opened the laptop again and pulled up another screen, employee training materials, orientation videos, policy documents. Every single person who works for Wellington Hotels goes through 40 hours of diversity and inclusion training. It's not optional. It's not a suggestion. It's a requirement. She looked directly at James. You sat through that training, James. You signed off on our mission statement. You acknowledged that you understood our values. James finally found his voice, but it came out as barely a whisper. I did understand. I do understand. I thought I was protecting the hotel's image. From what? Laura's voice was sharp. From successful professionals who happened to not be white? From families trying to celebrate their children's achievements? From doctors attending medical conferences? The questions hit like physical blows, and James visibly flinched with each one. I thought. He started, then stopped. My father always said. Your father. Laura leaned forward, sensing a deeper truth about to emerge. James took a shaky breath. My father managed a country club for 30 years. He always said the key to success in hospitality was knowing your clientele, understanding what they expected. He said you could tell within seconds whether someone would be a good fit for the establishment. And what did he tell you to look for? Laura's voice was dangerously quiet. People who carried themselves right. Who dressed appropriately. Who understood the culture of the place. James was barely audible now. He said maintaining standards wasn't about being mean to people, it was about protecting the experience for the guests who really belonged there. The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Laura felt a familiar mixture of rage and sadness. Rage at the perpetuation of systemic exclusion, sadness for the young man who had been raised to see discrimination as duty. Your father taught you to be a gatekeeper, Laura said simply. But James, you were never supposed to be guarding the gate. You were supposed to be opening it. She turned to the others, her gaze sweeping across their faces. All of you. Every single person in this room had the power to open that gate tonight. Instead, you chose to keep it closed. The truth settled over them like a judgment, inescapable and final. In the harsh fluorescent light of the conference room, there was nowhere left to hide from what they had done, and more importantly, what they had failed to do. Think about the last time you witnessed discrimination. Did you speak up or stay silent? What do you think shaped James's prejudices, and can people really change their deeply held biases? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The silence that followed Laura's revelation stretched for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. In that quiet space, something began to shift in the Neptune room's atmosphere. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first fragile stirrings of genuine understanding. James was the first to break the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. I never thought about it that way, he said, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. I honestly believed I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting something valuable. Laura studied his face, searching for signs of manipulation or deflection. Instead, she saw something she hadn't expected, genuine horror at his own actions. The polished front desk manager had been stripped away, leaving behind a young man confronting the ugly truth about what he'd become. What did you think you were protecting, James? Laura asked, her voice softer than it had been all evening. The experience, he said haltingly. The elegance. The feeling that this was a special place. He looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed with unshed tears. But I see now that I was really protecting exclusion. I was protecting the right of some people to never have to share space with others. Jennifer, who had been silent for most of the evening, suddenly spoke up. I have a confession to make, she said, her voice shaking. The night with Dr. Patel, I knew James was wrong. I looked her up after she left. She's one of the most respected cardiologists in the world. She saved thousands of lives. And we treated her like she was trying to scam us. Her voice broke completely. I went home that night and I felt sick about it. But I told myself it wasn't my place to question my supervisor. I told myself that James must have known something I didn't. Laura watched as tears began to flow down Jennifer's cheeks. I've been telling myself that lie for months. Every time it happened, I found a way to make it not my responsibility. Marcus, the concierge, cleared his throat. The Johnson family, he said quietly. Their little girl, she couldn't have been more than 8 years old. When her father was explaining to her why they had to leave, She asked if it was because they were black. His voice cracked. And her father, he just held her hand and said, "Sometimes, sweetheart, but that's not your fault." The image hit the room like a physical blow. Laura felt her own eyes fill with tears, remembering her own childhood experiences of being made to feel unwelcome in spaces where her family belonged. "I should have said something," Marcus continued. "I should have intervened. But I was scared of creating a scene, scared of making waves. I chose my own comfort over that little girl's dignity." Robert, who had been quiet throughout most of the meeting, finally spoke. "I've been in security for 15 years, he said, his deep voice filling the small room. "I've worked at places where I was the only black face on staff, where I had to prove myself every single day. When I got hired here, Ms. Wellington, I thought I'd found somewhere different." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Tonight, when I saw what was happening at the front desk, part of me recognized the situation immediately. I've been on the other side of it too many times. But I hesitated because I didn't want to believe it was happening here, in a place I'd come to think of as safe." Laura felt something crack open in her chest. These weren't just employees defending themselves anymore. They were human beings confronting their own failures, their own fears, their own capacity for both harm and healing. "The thing is," James said, his voice stronger now but still heavy with emotion, "my father didn't teach me to be cruel. He genuinely believed he was teaching me about excellence, about maintaining standards. But those standards were built on exclusion, and I never questioned that. I never asked who was being excluded or why." He looked directly at Laura for the first time since his identity had been revealed. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't deserve that. But I need you to know that what happened tonight has broken something in me that needed to be broken." Laura studied his face, seeing past the polished facade to the person underneath. There was pain there, real pain, and something that looked like the beginning of wisdom born from consequences. "James," she said slowly, "do you know why I named this hotel chain Wellington?" He shook his head. "It wasn't after my family name, though that's what everyone assumes. It was after Wellington Mara, a football executive who fought to integrate the NFL in the 1940s. He said something that stuck with me: excellence isn't about keeping the wrong people out. It's about bringing the right values in." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Every person we turned away tonight, every guest we've redirected over the past 18 months, they weren't threats to our excellence. They were opportunities to prove it." The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Less accusatory, more contemplative. Laura could see the staff processing not just their failures, but the possibility of doing better. "Ms. Wellington," Jennifer said hesitantly, "what happens now? I know I don't have the right to ask, but is there any way to make this right? Not for our jobs, but for the people we hurt." Laura felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected: hope. "What do you think we should do, Jennifer?" I think we need to find them. The guests we turned away. We need to apologize, really apologize, and invite them back. Not with discounts or corporate vouchers, but with genuine acknowledgement of what we did wrong." "That's a start," Laura said, and for the first time all evening, her voice carried a note of warmth. "What else?" "Change the training," Marcus said. "Not just add to it, but fundamentally change it. Make it about recognizing our biases, not just following policies. Create accountability systems," Robert added. "Ways for staff to speak up when they see discrimination happening, without fear of retaliation." "And," James said, his voice quiet but determined, maybe people like me need to hear from people like the guests we turned away. Really hear their stories, understand what our professional judgment actually does to real human beings." Laura looked around the table at faces that had been transformed over the course of the evening. The defensive postures were gone, replaced by something more vulnerable but also more genuine. "Those are all good ideas," she said. "But they only work if you mean them. If this conversation changes how you see people, not just how you process policies." One by one, they nodded. Not with the quick agreement of people trying to save their jobs, but with the slow, heavy acknowledgement of people accepting responsibility for change. For the first time since entering the hotel that evening, Laura felt something like peace beginning to settle in her chest. Not resolution, that would take much longer, but the possibility of it. Just as the fragile bonds of understanding began to solidify in the Neptune room, Laura's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and her face went pale. It was Richard Blackstone, chairman of the Blackstone Investment Group and the primary investor who had backed her expansion into international markets. "I need to take this," she said, stepping away from the table. "Richard, it's late." "What's?" "Laura, we have a problem," Richard's voice crackled through the speaker, loud enough that everyone in the room could hear. "I'm getting calls about some kind of incident at your flagship property. Something about staff being terminated? Guests posting videos on social media." Laura's heart sank as she realized that their private reckoning had already started leaking into the public sphere. She moved closer to the phone, lowering her voice, but Richard continued at his original volume. "Look, I know you've got your social justice initiatives, but we can't afford a scandal right now. The Tokyo deal just closed, we've got the London expansion pending, and the last thing we need is negative publicity about discrimination lawsuits." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Laura watched as the faces around the table shifted, the vulnerability and openness that had been building over the past hour suddenly replaced by calculation and fear. "Richard, let me call you back." "No, Laura, we need to handle this now. I'm having my crisis management team draft a statement. We're going to frame this as a personnel issue, one rogue employee who didn't represent company values. Quick termination, full apology, case closed." James, who had been leaning forward with genuine remorse just moments before, suddenly straightened in his chair. His expression hardened as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. "One rogue employee," he said, his voice cutting through the phone conversation. "Is that what I am to you, Ms. Wellington? The convenient scapegoat who keeps your investors happy?" Laura tried to wave him quiet, but the damage was already done. Richard's voice sharpened on the other end of the line. "Who is that? Laura, please tell me you don't have the terminated employee still on the premises. This is exactly the kind of liability issue that could." "He hasn't been terminated," Laura said quietly. The silence on the phone was deafening. When Richard spoke again, his voice was ice cold. "What do you mean he hasn't been terminated? Laura, I've got 3 board members calling me about viral videos of a discrimination incident at your hotel. The only way we contain this is immediate, decisive action. Fire him, apologize, move on." James laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the small room. "There it is," he said, standing up from his chair. "All that talk about change and growth and learning from mistakes. But when it comes down to it, when your investors get nervous, it's just easier to throw the little guy under the bus." "James, that's not," Laura started, but he cut her off. "Isn't it?" His voice was rising, and the vulnerability from minutes before had been replaced by anger and betrayal. "You sit here talking about opening gates and bringing the right values in, but the moment your money is threatened, you're ready to sacrifice me to protect your company's image." Jennifer was looking between them with growing alarm. "James, she didn't say she was going to fire you." "She didn't have to," James snapped. "Her investor just laid out the playbook. One rogue employee, quick termination, case closed. Just like that, I become the villain who absolves everyone else of responsibility." Richard's voice crackled through the phone again. "Laura, are you going to handle this professionally, or do I need to call an emergency board meeting?" The threat was unmistakable. Laura looked around the room at the faces staring back at her, James's bitter anger, Jennifer's growing panic, Marcus's disappointment, Robert's resigned sadness. The moment of genuine connection they'd built was crumbling in real time. "All this time," James continued, his voice getting louder, "you've been setting me up to take the fall. Making me confess, getting me to admit my mistakes, recording everything. It was never about change or growth, it was about building your case for termination." "That's not true," Laura said, but her voice lacked conviction. The phone call with Richard had shattered her focus, and she could see how the evening's events might look from James's perspective. "Really?" James pulled out his own phone. "Because I just got a text from Danny in security. Apparently, there are already news vans outside. Channel 7 is calling this discrimination scandal rocks luxury hotel chain. Want to guess whose name is featured prominently in the headlines?" Laura felt the walls of the conference room closing in on her. Everything she had built, the company, the reputation, the mission, was potentially crumbling because of one evening's revelation of what had been happening under her nose. "And the best part," James continued, his anger now mixed with hurt, "is that none of you will have to face any real consequences. Jennifer gets to keep her job because she was just following orders. Marcus gets to keep his job because he was just being polite. Robert gets to keep his job because he was just hesitating. But me? I'm the face of discrimination who must be immediately eliminated to protect the brand. The accuracy of his assessment hung in the air like an indictment. Laura realized that despite all her talk of systemic change and collective responsibility, the economic pressures of her business were pushing her toward exactly the kind of scapegoating she claimed to oppose. "Ms. Wellington," Jennifer said quietly, "maybe James has a point. This doesn't feel like justice. It feels like damage control." Richard's voice erupted from the phone again. "Laura, I don't care about feelings or fairness right now. I care about protecting a billion-dollar investment. You have 1 hour to resolve this situation, or I'm calling the board." The line went dead, leaving them in devastating silence. James walked to the door, his hand on the handle. "You know what the really tragic part is," he said without turning around. "For about 20 minutes tonight, I actually believed you were different. I actually believed this company was different. I thought maybe there was a way to make this right that didn't involve destroying people's lives." He turned back to face the room, his expression a mixture of anger and profound disappointment. "But you're just like every other corporate executive I've ever met. When it comes down to choosing between doing the right thing and protecting your bottom line, there's really no choice at all." Laura opened her mouth to respond, to explain, to defend herself and her intentions. But the words wouldn't come. Because in that moment, faced with the choice between her principles and her investors' demands, she wasn't sure which path she was going to choose. And everyone in the room could see her hesitation. The bonds of trust and understanding that had been so carefully built over the evening lay in ruins around them, shattered by the harsh reality of corporate accountability and public relations damage control. James opened the door, and for a moment, it seemed like he might walk out and never look back. The silence in the Neptune room stretched like a chasm between who Laura had always believed herself to be and who she was about to become. James stood at the door, his hand still on the handle, waiting for her response. The weight of every principle she'd ever professed hung in the balance of this single moment. Laura closed her eyes and saw herself at 26 again, sitting in that Charleston motel room, making those 2 promises that had shaped her entire career. Then she opened them and looked at James, really looked at him, seeing not a liability to be managed or a scapegoat to be sacrificed, but a young man whose life was about to be destroyed by the very system she'd sworn to change. "No," she said quietly. "What?" Jennifer asked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Laura stood up slowly, her decision crystallizing with each word. "No, I'm not going to fire James. I'm not going to let him become the convenient villain in this story." James's grip on the door handle loosened slightly, confusion replacing the anger in his expression. Laura picked up her phone and dialed Richard's number. When he answered on the first ring, his voice sharp with impatience, she didn't give him a chance to speak. "Richard, this is how we're going to handle this situation," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Tomorrow morning, I'm calling a press conference. I'm going to take full responsibility for the systemic discrimination that has been happening at this hotel." "Laura, have you lost your mind?" Richard's voice exploded through the speaker. "That's corporate suicide. You'll destroy the company." "I'm going to explain that this wasn't the action of one rogue employee, but the failure of leadership, my failure, to create systems that actually prevent discrimination instead of just claiming to oppose it." She looked around the room at the faces staring back at her in shock and growing amazement. "I'm going to announce a complete overhaul of our hiring, training, and accountability practices. Every single guest who was turned away under false pretenses will be contacted personally by me, with a full apology and an invitation to return as our honored guest." "Laura, stop this right now," Richard's voice was ice cold. "The board will never approve this approach. You're talking about admitting liability for potentially millions in damages." Laura felt a strange calm settling over her, the same feeling she'd had years ago when she decided to leave the security of her corporate job to start her own company. "Then I guess the board will need to decide whether they want to be part of a company that actually stands for something, or just another business that puts profit over people." She could hear Richard breathing heavily on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted to something more calculating. "You realize what you're risking here? Not just your company, but your entire career. No one will invest in a CEO who admits to systemic discrimination. You'll be unemployable." Maybe, Laura said. But I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. The line went quiet for a long moment. Then Richard's voice came back, colder than before. Fine. You want to commit professional suicide? That's your choice. But don't expect the board or the investors to go down with you. I'll be calling an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning to discuss replacing you as CEO. I understand, Laura said simply. Do what you need to do, Richard. She hung up the phone and looked around the room. James had moved away from the door and was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Why? He asked finally. Why would you risk everything for someone who hurt your company? Laura sat back down, feeling suddenly exhausted but also lighter than she had in hours. Because, James, you're not the only one who made mistakes tonight. I created a company culture that was supposed to prevent discrimination, but I didn't create systems that actually would prevent it. I hired managers and gave them authority without ensuring they understood not just the policies, but the principles behind them. She gestured toward the complaint database still open on her laptop. 13 guests were turned away over 18 months, and I had no idea. Not because the information wasn't available, but because I wasn't looking for it. I was so focused on expansion and growth that I forgot to protect the mission that started this whole thing. Jennifer was crying quietly, but this time they seemed to be tears of relief rather than fear. Ms. Wellington, she said, what happens to us now? I mean, if you lose the company. I don't know, Laura admitted. I might lose everything. The company, my reputation, my ability to continue in this industry. But I know what happens if I don't make this choice. I become someone I can't respect. And this company becomes exactly the kind of place I started it to replace. Marcus spoke up for the first time in a while. What can we do? To help, I mean. To make this right. Laura looked at him with genuine warmth. You can help me document everything. Every guest we turned away, every complaint we dismissed, every time our systems failed someone who trusted us. We're going to contact every single person and make this right, even if it bankrupts us. And after that? Robert asked. After that, we're going to rebuild. Different systems, better training, real accountability. And if the board fires me and the investors pull out, then maybe we'll have to start smaller. Maybe we'll have to prove ourselves all over again. But we'll do it right this time. James was still standing by the door, but his posture had changed. The anger was gone, replaced by something that might have been hope. You're really willing to lose everything? He asked. For principles? Laura thought about the question for a moment, then smiled, the first genuine smile she'd had all evening. James, I realized something tonight. I didn't build this company to get rich or powerful or famous. I built it because I believed hospitality could be better. If I compromise that belief to save the business, then I've already lost everything that mattered. She stood up and extended her hand toward him. So here's my question for you, and for all of you. Are you willing to help me rebuild this the right way? Even if it means we might fail? Even if it means starting over with nothing but our commitment to do better? James looked at her outstretched hand, then around the room at the faces of his colleagues. When he reached out to shake it, his grip was firm and steady. Yes, he said simply. I think I'd like to help you build something worth believing in. One by one, the others stood and joined them, forming a circle of hands and commitment in the small conference room where everything had fallen apart and was now, maybe, beginning to come back together. 6 months later. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Grandview Hotel's grand atrium as Laura Wellington stood at the same front desk where everything had changed. But this time, she wasn't a tired traveler seeking a room. She was welcoming back Dr. Aisha Patel, the cardiologist who had been turned away 18 months earlier. Dr. Patel, Laura said, extending her hand with genuine warmth, welcome back to the Grandview. We are truly honored to have you here. Dr. Patel smiled, though Laura could see the wariness that still lingered in her eyes. I have to admit, Ms. Wellington, I never expected to receive a personal phone call from a hotel CEO, let alone an invitation to return. You deserved much more than a phone call, Laura replied. You deserve to be treated with respect from the moment you walked through our doors the first time. Behind the front desk stood Jennifer, now the assistant guest relations manager. Her training expanded far beyond policy compliance to include active bias recognition and intervention strategies. Next to her was Marcus, who had been promoted to guest experience coordinator after designing a revolutionary feedback system that tracked not just guest satisfaction, but guest dignity. Dr. Patel, Jennifer said, stepping forward with a genuine smile, "We have your suite ready, and I wanted to personally ensure that everything meets your expectations. If there's anything at all, that we can do to make your stay more comfortable, please don't hesitate to ask." The sincerity in Jennifer's voice was unmistakable. Over the past 6 months, she had become one of the most passionate advocates for the hotel's transformation, volunteering to lead sensitivity training sessions and personally following up with every guest who had previously been redirected. Laura watched the interaction with a mixture of pride and lingering sadness. The road to this moment had been brutal. The press conference 6 months ago had indeed triggered a media firestorm. Richard Blackstone had followed through on his threat, calling an emergency board meeting to remove her as CEO. The investor backlash had been swift and severe. But something unexpected had happened. The story of a CEO choosing principles over profit had resonated with people in ways Laura never could have predicted. Social media had erupted with support. Other hospitality professionals had come forward with their own stories of systemic discrimination. Most importantly, guests, particularly guests of color, had begun sharing their experiences and praising Laura's transparency. Within 2 months, Wellington Hotels had received inquiries from new investors, people who wanted to be part of a company that was willing to confront its failures honestly. Smaller investors, ethical funds, and impact investors had replaced the traditional Wall Street backing. The company was now independently owned and operated, with Laura maintaining full control over its direction and values. The transformation hadn't stopped with leadership changes. James Morrison, who everyone expected to disappear into unemployment and disgrace, had instead become one of the most effective voices for change within the organization. "Ms. Wellington," came a familiar voice from across the atrium. Laura turned to see James approaching with a group of new employees, his latest training cohort. Over the past 6 months, he had developed and implemented a revolutionary hospitality training program that was now being adopted by hotels across the country. "How did the session go?" Laura asked. "Better than I hoped," James replied, his face bright with genuine enthusiasm. "We had some difficult conversations about unconscious bias, but that's where the real learning happens. These folks are going to make amazing additions to our team." Laura still marveled at the transformation in James. The defensive, prejudiced manager had been replaced by someone who spoke openly about his past failures and used them as teaching tools. His program, Hospitality with Humanity, had become so successful that other companies were paying Wellington Hotels to train their staff. "Dr. Patel," James said, approaching the cardiologist with respect, "I'm James Morrison. I was the manager who turned you away 18 months ago, and I wanted to personally apologize for the harm I caused you." Dr. Patel studied his face carefully. "That takes courage, Mr. Morrison." "It takes honesty," James corrected. "And I'm still learning how to lead with that instead of fear." Robert, now the director of guest safety and inclusion, approached the group with a warm smile. His role had expanded far beyond traditional security to encompass creating an environment where every guest felt not just safe, but genuinely welcomed. "Dr. Patel, if you'd like, I'd be happy to show you some of the changes we've made since your last visit," he offered. "We've implemented some systems that I think you'll find interesting." As the group moved through the hotel, Laura reflected on how much had changed. The complaint system had been completely redesigned to make it easy for guests to report discrimination. Mystery shoppers regularly tested the staff's response to diverse guests. Most importantly, every employee now understood that their job wasn't just to serve guests, but to ensure every guest felt valued and respected. The financial results had been surprising. Despite the initial investor exodus and negative publicity, occupancy rates had actually increased. The hotel's reputation for authentic hospitality and inclusive service had attracted a diverse clientele who appreciated staying somewhere that aligned with their values. Corporate clients, particularly those focused on diversity and inclusion, had made the Grandview their preferred venue. "Ms. Wellington," Dr. Patel said as they concluded the tour, "I have to say, this feels like a completely different place. Not just the policies, but the atmosphere. Everyone here seems genuinely committed to making guests feel welcome." "That's because they are," Laura replied. "We learned that you can't mandate respect, you have to cultivate it. You have to hire people who already value human dignity, then give them the tools and authority to act on those values." As the afternoon wore on, Laura found herself back in the Neptune room, now renamed the Reflection Room, where the transformation had begun. A small plaque on the door read, "A place for difficult conversations and honest growth." James knocked on the open door. "Mind if I join you?" "Please," Laura said, gesturing to a chair. "How are you feeling about all this?" James was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd destroyed everything I'd worked for. But sitting here now, knowing that we've helped change how an entire industry thinks about hospitality, I've never felt more purposeful." He paused, looking around the room where he had once defended his prejudices so fiercely. "You gave me something I never expected when you refused to fire me," he said. "You gave me the chance to become someone better. Not just to apologize for who I was, but to actively work to undo the harm I caused." Laura felt tears prick at her eyes. "You did the work, James. I just didn't give up on you. The way you didn't give up on the company, even when it would have been easier to take the safe path." A knock at the door interrupted them. Jennifer entered, holding an envelope with a nervous smile. "Ms. Wellington, this just arrived by courier. It's from the American Hospitality Association." Laura opened the envelope and read the contents, her eyes widening in surprise. "We've been nominated for the Excellence in Hospitality Innovation Award," she said, looking up at James and Jennifer, "for our groundbreaking approach to creating inclusive guest experiences." James laughed, a sound of pure joy. 6 months ago, we were a discrimination scandal. Now we're being recognized for innovation. "It's not about the award," Laura said, though she was smiling broadly. "It's about what it represents. We didn't just rebuild after our failure, we built something better than what existed before." Later that evening, Laura stood in the penthouse suite she had originally been denied, looking out over the city lights. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Patel. "Thank you for showing me that companies really can change. This visit restored my faith in corporate leadership." Another text followed from Marcus Washington, the software executive who had been turned away months earlier and had returned the previous week. "My family felt so welcomed during our stay. My daughter said it was the first hotel where she felt like she truly belonged." As Laura read message after message from guests whose trust they had rebuilt, she realized that her greatest fear, losing everything, had been replaced by her greatest joy, building something worth believing in. The journey had cost her the company she originally built, but it had given her something more valuable, a business that actually lived its values, a team that genuinely cared about human dignity, and the knowledge that even after the deepest failures, redemption was possible. She pulled out her phone and started typing her own message, "To every employee in the Wellington Hotel's family. 6 months ago, we learned who we really were when everything was on the line. Today, we know who we choose to be every single day. Thank you for choosing love over fear, growth over comfort, and truth over convenience. This is just the beginning." As she hit send, Laura smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose principles over profit, and new chances to prove that hospitality, real hospitality, was about opening doors, not guarding them. The girl who had once been made to feel unwelcome had built an empire of belonging. And this time, she had done it right. What's the most meaningful way you've ever seen someone transform after making a serious mistake? Do you believe people and companies can truly change, or do you think it's usually just better PR? I'd love to hear your thoughts on redemption and second chances in the comments below. You've made it all the way to the end of today's story. Thank you so much for staying with us. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our exciting stories. More amazing content is on the way just for you.